Good day, everybody. Happy to be here. Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center. Today, we're going to be discussing chapter one, or book one, of the Origins of Totalitarianism, which is on anti-Semitism. As I've mentioned, this is a long book, over 100 pages, and it's a book that Arendt herself says is she researched it over 20 years. She started researching it in Paris when she arrived in 1933, and she says in the book that shockingly nobody had written a book on anti-Semitism up till this point. It just wasn't a topic, or at least in the 20th century, and she decides to publish a lot of material in this book that she thinks is valuable, that she's discovered, but that is a bit extraneous and outside of the argument. And so it's a long section, and a lot of it is interesting, but again, a bit sidetracked. So I've asked you to read parts of it that I think are the most important for what we're doing. It's a fascinating book. Or it is a book in itself, published separately as a book on anti-Semitism, and really one of the few books on anti-Semitism out there. There are more now. It's controversial. There's a lot in it that people have challenged. Its methodology is, as with Arendt in general, one that is complicated. It's not a straight history, and it's not a straight work of philosophy. At almost every stage of the book on anti-Semitism and also the book on Origins of Totalitarianism, she sort of does both. She makes associative moves between philosophy and history that doesn't really fit in either camp, and this has caused a number of people to sort of wonder what she really is, what's she doing. And what she says she's doing, just to come back to her, is that she's trying to unpack the crystallized elements of totalitarianism. And one of those crystalline elements that she thinks is clearly related to totalitarianism as it emerged in Germany and also in Russia in the 20th century is anti-Semitism. This was to her shocking because the Jews were such a small and unimportant people in the scheme of things in Europe. And why should they be so important? This book, this long book on anti-Semitism, is an attempt to answer that question. I want to get to your points. I want to try and have as much of a discussion as possible because I think this is something that many of you have strong opinions on. I want to just point out two things in the beginning. One is that for her, anti-Semitism is not anti-Jew hatred. There is anti-Jew hatred. She writes that when she wants to talk about it with anti-capital S to say that it's an opposition to the Semites as a Jewish people. But what she's saying is that the anti-Semitism of the Nazis, and there's primarily the Nazis, but also to a certain extent the Bolsheviks, really was what she calls a secular 19th century ideology. It was not about Jews, and often the anti-Semitism that emerged in areas where there were the fewest Jews. That's an interesting corollary to what's going on in certain places around the world today. Let's just say the United States. Anti-Semitism has grown incredibly rapidly around what we might call the fringe right or the alt-right. And people are being attacked as Jews by the fringe right, many of whom are not Jewish. A good friend of mine, Danielle Allen, or a friend of mine, has written a number of articles about Trump and has been just excoriated for being a Jew. Now, she's a black woman, but she's not a Jew. And yet people have been just attacking her in vicious anti-Semitic attacks. Katie Rich, who some of you know was relieved of her duties at Saturday Night Live recently, has been attacked vociferously as a Jew, and yet she's not Jewish. And one of the aspects of anti-Semitism as it emerged that Arendt was most interested in, and I think she uniquely among thinkers of anti-Semitism saw, was that it wasn't anti-Jewish so much as it was an ideology that relates to Jews, and we have to think about why it became anti-Semitism and not anti-something else. But it was in a certain way, as an ideology, disconnected from Jews. The second point I want to make, just to highlight, is that she distinguishes social anti-Semitism from political anti-Semitism. Social anti-Semitism is the discrimination one experiences in society, looking for a job, or making remarks, or what happened to my friend Daniel Allen or Katie Rich or others. It's the anti-Semitism that makes you feel bad, that discriminates against a job, that prevents you from being taken into seriously and getting invited to parties. Political and by the way, and she writes about social anti-Semitism in many of her books, and she thinks it's awful and deeply corrosive to Jews, but also to society at large. But totalitarianism is not, in her view, related to social anti-Semitism. It's related to political anti-Semitism. And that's connected to the decline of the nation state and the rise of imperialism. So for her, imperialist anti-Semitism, political anti-Semitism, called for the elimination not of the Jews in order to purify a national soul, but rather for the extermination of the Jews as a human race. See, nationalist anti-Semitism, social anti-Semitism wants to get Jews out of my life. I don't want to see them. I don't want to interact with them. I want them out of my state. But political anti-Semitism on an imperialist level says the Jews have to be eliminated. It's a much different thing. And she was interested, because it was part of the totalitarian ideology, of how that happened and why it happened. And so she can say that the Nazis had a genuine and never revoked contempt for the narrowness of nationalism and the provincialism of the nation state, and they repeated time and again that their movement, international in scope, was more important than in any state which would necessarily be bound to a specific territory. I bring this up because it's one of the biggest misunderstandings, I think, of totalitarianism, and even people who know Arendt well forget this about her argument, that totalitarianism is not associated with nationalism, and anti-Semitism, as it emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries, was not associated with nationalism, which is, again, interesting within our own current situation, because so much of what's currently going on is about nationalism. And that does raise questions about the differences between what's going on now in the world and what Arendt was describing. Finally, I think it's important for us to know that for her, the reason anti-Semitism emerged and not anti-X, not anti-something else, not the bicyclists, really was that more than anything else, and this is on page 240, so this is in another section, we'll get to it later, but I just wanted to bring it up, was the even more obvious fact that the pan movement's claim to chosenness could clash seriously only with the Jewish claim. And this is actually a big part of her argument, that the pan movements, the German pan movement, the pan-Aryan movement, the pan-Slavic movement, which she argues in chapter 8 are sort of the precursors of totalitarianism, saw themselves as chosen people. And the Jews, as a chosen people, were the great concurrence, were the great people who they had to judge themselves against. In a sense, they almost respected the Jews more than other people, because the Jews were the other people that claimed to be chosen. And since the Aryan and Slavic movements thought their movements were chosen and were destined for world domination, the Jews were a deep problem and had to be eliminated to prove that it was the Aryans and the Slavs and not the Jews that were chosen. And so these 2 points about anti-Semitism being connected to not to Jews per se, and this political anti-Semitism not connected to nationalism and seen as a competition for world domination, are two of the most important points that Arendt talks about in this book. So I wanted to get those out, and I know there's questions. I know that earlier, before we all got on, or I started talking, Bob Meyerson was speaking, and he and Jack were maybe having a conversation. Bob, do you or Jack want to frame the question you guys were raising at the beginning and put it back in our little room?
I was probably just trying to stir the pot a bit before you came on, Roger, and see what kind of reaction I could get. But I certainly agree with Arendt's analysis, her overall analysis. But I do think there are some problems with her accuracy, not only in what has been written in the 60 years since she wrote this book, but also at the time she was writing. I think she had a tendency to generalize, to rush to a conclusion, without maybe being a little more measured than she could have been. And I particularly challenged her point that the Jews were losing their political function or significance at the time of the rise of totalitarianism, because to my way of thinking, they were almost never more successful politically, and this is after Disraeli, but under Walter Rathenau, who, in World War I was maybe the chief architect of German preparedness, and of course he was assassinated. And in the 30s, Leon Blum, who in France led the Popular Front, and there maybe are many other examples. So that's what I was trying to point out.
Jack, did you want to add anything, or if anyone else wants to jump in? This is I think this book is not immune to criticism, as is all of Arendt's work and anyone's work. She's not a historian, and Bob is right that there are a number of her conclusions that have been challenged. And I'm not a historian. I will say that some of the challenges are more vague than specific. So, for example, she's been heavily criticized for citing Nazi sources. If you read the footnotes, not all by any means, but a number of the footnotes she cites were Nazis. And people have said, see, that shows she's a Nazi. Her view, and I think she's 100% right, is if you want to understand Nazism, it actually helps to read Nazis. And so she reads them and cites them because she's actually interested in what they had to say and what they meant. And to call her a Nazi sympathizer, as many have, I'm not saying Bob did, but that's what some people have done, because she cites the Nazi literature, I think is really ludicrous. Bob brought up a particular point about Jewish power, and it's one that she talks about in chapter 2. The argument here is that, well, there's sort of two arguments. One is that throughout Jewish history, the Jews have largely been apolitical, and they've largely been diasporic peoples living in other people's countries, and have largely stayed to themselves and never gained a kind of political tradition. And that then in the 17th century or so, with the rise of certain nation states and princes, the Jews, because they were the bankers and they could provide funding, began to fund some of these smaller princes. And in return for that, they got money and privileges. Not money, privileges. And then when the French Revolution happened, the Jews couldn't afford to fund the whole thing, but they fanned out and they created networks throughout Europe of Jewish bankers that would help fund the larger nation states, and that expanded the area of Jewish privilege. And then there was a third phase as the nation state began to disintegrate. The Jews were associated with the nation state, and then finally, when the nation state did disintegrate, even though the Jews had nothing to do with it, the political anger against the nation state came to be directed in many ways against the Jews. It's a broad brush history. Bob is right to be skeptical of it. Are there problems with it? I'm sure there are. I don't know enough to say whether it's absolutely right or absolutely wrong. I'm happy to hear other people comment on that. The argument is simply part of her overarching argument. Two parts. One, that the Jews themselves were not practiced in politics, and two, to the extent they were associated with the nation state. And as imperialism rose and the nation state became unpopular, the Jews were seen as associated with the nation state, and that unpopularity transferred to the Jews.
Roger, this is Jack. Can you hear me?
Hi, Jack.
Hi. I also posted something that actually just touches on this this part of the conversation. So I don't want to go into my question, which I think I'd like us to discuss a little later. But with reference to the question of the leadership of Rathenau and Blum and so on and so forth, that fits like a glove with Hannah Arendt's analysis, because their leadership, so to speak, and if you go into America and you take the position that Morgenthau, for example, took in the U.S. government, their leadership does not represent the leadership of the Jewish people. It's a representation of the assimilated Jew taking on the interests of the state to which they have now joined allegiance. So Rathenau is not an internationalist of the type that the Rothschilds were, and Blum certainly was not. So I think that in a way, Howard proves his own point, that by naming these people, he points to the actuality of the separation between the emancipated Jews, which she talks about, the separation between the emancipated Jews and those who clung to the religion and the identification of the race, if I may call it that, because she has some of them referring to it that way. That is, the people who were insistently Jewish. And my question really had to do with her personal situation, which was that of an emancipated Jew living in Germany at a time when emancipated Jews had quite a lot of privilege, and then to have that privilege taken away by political anti-Semitism, that probably impacted the way she thought about things. So, and I want to go on to that a little bit later, but I think her main point, as you outlined it, I think, is really borne out by the reality of history.
Great. Jack, I'm going to come back to your other question in a little bit. I'm going to stick on this, and I want to first answer a clarification question from I don't know how to pronounce it, Ruji Tan, and then we'll go on to a question from Sam. But the first question from Ruji is very simple. What is the meaning of the concept of nation state in her thought? And I say it's simple, but it's not. This is one of the most important ideas in this book, and it's an idea that's somewhat uniquely Arendt's. So a nation and a state is a composite idea. It's made of two things: a nation and a state. A nation is more like an ethnic people. So the Jews could be a nation if you think of them as a nation. Some people don't; they think of them only as a religion. But a more standard view of a nation would be the the Franks in France, or the Anglo-Saxons in England, or the Czechs in Czechoslovakia, or the Slovaks in Czechoslovakia. These are all nations. They're national peoples with a national identity. And a state is a legalized, bureaucratic, territorial entity that treats all citizens within it equally. And so within a nation state, there is a constant tension. On the one hand, in every nation state, insofar as it's a state, everybody is supposed to be equal. On the other hand, insofar as it's a nation state, there is an overriding tendency to give the national people of that state preferences. And the state becomes, in a sense, compromised as a state insofar as it's a nation state. So let me go to that, and then let's have Sam. Sam, do you want to come on and read your question, and because it seems to continue on where we're coming from, or your point?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So you were talking about how Arendt isn't really concerned with the nation state, and so part of what I was trying to get at is for us to kind of tease out this the concept of the nation state that's at play in Origins, which is really central to her understanding of what's happening, the structural transformation of the nation state that's happening in this time period. And so the way I had read it is, at the time, the rise of imperialism was associated with the strength of the nation state, the rise of the nation state. And Arendt is contradicting this common held view and saying that the decline of the nation state is actually tied to imperialism. And so I'm just wondering how we can think about nationalism as an expansive concept within Arendt's framework, because she also, so I don't know, on page, I was looking at page, I have the page 30 in the Samantha Power. But she says, only at the end of the 19th century, with the rise of imperialism, did the owning classes begin to change their original estimate of the unproductivity of state business. Imperialist expansion, together with the growing perfection of the instruments of violence and the state's absolute monopoly of them, made the state an interesting business proposition. And so for her, it's the boundaries of the state needing to expand in order to expand the business growth of the state. And I think that is a form of nationalism. I would say that's very much a form that tied to a form of nationalism. And then later she talks about the export of military troops and the need for assimilation. And this is ultimately in part why there was what she calls the boomerang effect. It leads to the decline of the nation state ultimately, instead of bolstering it, that's what I was thinking about.
Yeah, these are important questions, especially, I think, particularly if we want to try and think from Arendt to today, because we're witnessing a nationalist movement that is both related to and also in opposition to globalization. And I think what Sam is saying is that the imperialist movement was both nationalist and anti-nationalist. If that's the way I would put it. She may not agree. And so it was nationalist insofar as the bourgeoisie that had investments in factories in Germany, to take one example, found that they needed cheaper raw materials and new markets. And the way they did that is they went to Africa or other places, and yet they needed protection. And so they went to the nation state and said, give me troops to protect my, investments in Africa. And so there's a way in which the nation state clearly was involved in imperialism. But Arendt is making two further points. One is that if you look at what the Nazis said, forget the bourgeoisie, and what the Bolsheviks said, is that they always talked about a world domination. They were not interested in owning Germany. They were interested in taking over the world. And they talked about a pan-German movement that could make alliances with other pure races. And same with the Soviets, who wanted to create a world proletariat. And so on one level, these movements specifically made alliances beyond the nation and saw nationalist politicians that wanted to protect the borders and give preference to people within the borders of Germany or Russia as retrograde. And so in reading these folks, she found them to be deeply antithetical to nationalism. One of the things we're seeing today, both in the United States with President Trump and in Europe with Viktor Orban in Hungary and Erdogan in Turkey and Putin in Russia, is a real strong claim of national interest. And, that is very different from both the Bolshevik and the Nazi rhetoric. And that doesn't mean that there aren't similarities that we can look at, but they're very different, and we need to take that seriously. In addition, beyond the Aryan and Slavic, pan-Aryan and pan-Slavic movements, there's the sense that there's the idea that in imperialism, we need to constantly expand, and that means our borders have to constantly get bigger. And the very idea of a meaningly circumscribed nation with common national characteristics becomes actually a problem and a limit to power and imperialist expansion. And so she wants to argue that both these movements were importantly and deeply anti-nationalist. That doesn't mean that the army, which was a national army, wasn't important. And one of the other aspects of that she'll talk about is how the greatest institutional locus of resistance to Nazism was the army. And she argues that that was the case in Germany because the army was nationalist and didn't want to get caught up in these internationalist escapades. And I think you can make a similar case that that might be true in the United States today, that one of the great institutional to the extent that the president wants to go on international escapades, the army as a nationalist institution would provide a break on that, possibly. At least it's a thought. Sam, you want to respond? You got to turn your mic on.
Yeah, I'm not. I have to think about whether or not I agree, but I wonder then today. So I think that we have a kind of fluid concept of there's a play going on between nationalism and nation state. And I think economic expansion today in the 21st century isn't going to look like it did in the 19th century. And perhaps the dangerous part of that is that it's actually turning us towards more nationalist movements. It's going to be a different kind of imperialism. So when Donald Trump says America first or trade deals only that put American economic interest at first, that's both expansionist in the sense that Arendt is talking about it, and it's also nationalist because it's prioritizing American interest. So I'll stop.
Okay, maybe we should go on to another question. Jack, do you want to?
Sorry, Roger.
Yeah, I just want to jump in here very quickly on the question of nationalism because I'm interested in our reading of this book in the present context. So one of the things that I see in Arendt is that she makes the case, and actually more Berkowitz makes the case, that Bolshevism is not nationalist. But of course, we know that Bolshevism devolved into what I call Stalinism, which was not Bolshevism at all. Stalin tried to make a case for socialism in one country. And at the very beginning, at least, the Soviet Union was set up as a federation of separate nation states who were federated under a single state mechanism. With reference to the Jews, despite the very high level of anti-Semitism in that territory, at the beginning they actually talked about creating land for the Jews within the Soviet Union, a land so that they would fulfill the requirement for a nation state, because they had all of the requirements except territory. So they were going to create some territory. What happened later and how anti-Semitism came to play into that is a whole other later part of the history. But I'm concerned because today, what we see today is something in some ways interestingly similar, and we don't see, and most people don't see it, which is all of those countries that you named, although their leadership speaks of nationhood and like America first, they speak to each other about a common enemy. And that common enemy is variously called radical Islam. And what I see building is some kind of federation, international federation that includes Asian, European, and America against, on one hand, economically Asia, and as the fulcrum for that fight against Asia, the imperialist fight against Asia, hatred of Muslims. And so in this way, I think there's a lot of similarity in some of the things that we're seeing today to what we saw in the development of both Nazism and Stalinism.
I'm going to ask Masha Gessen to come in if she would. She made a comment. She knows much more about Russia than I ever will. On a bad day, she knows more than I ever will on a good day. So, Masha, you want to chime in on this? As she takes, Masha, you there?
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
Just very quickly, I actually agree with some of what both Sam and Jack said, and I disagree, Roger, with part of what you said, which is that what I think is usually referred to as Putin's nationalism is, I think, more accurately described as imperialism. It's expansionist, and his ideology is pan-Russian. The pretext for invading Ukraine was the need to defend ethnic Russians there. So I share Sam's concern and interest in Trump's sort of amorphous nationalism, because I think that he's very likely to be pulled by Putin into a conversation about sort of world dominance and spheres of influence. And so that his sort of America first nationalism is, I think, very likely to very quickly edge into a question of sort of territory of dominance and to become expansionist.
I think that's a fair worry. I mean, to the extent that, one would have to think about what Pan-Americanism would look like. And it could certainly take the form of something like Anglo-American, re-emerging the Anglo-American sort of pact between Theresa May and Trump. It could also be, as I think Jack was saying, or Sam, or both, related to a culture clash of values between Judeo-Christianity and Islam. I think that's certainly possible, and I think it's certainly there in some of the right rhetoric. I'm a little more skeptical of that. I mean, I think, again, I don't know Trump. I don't know much about him. He's called for, immigration constraints, but he is, I don't see him as someone likely to seek to eliminate Muslims either from this country or from the world. I could be wrong, and I certainly hope I'm not. But it doesn't strike me that that's been a meaningful part of his thought. He seems to have a basic belief that people who are citizens of this country are citizens of this country, and doesn't matter what religion or race they have. I'm happy to have people disagree with me on that. I hope I'm right, but I fear if I'm wrong. But to the extent I'm right, it does suggest that it's hard to imagine him embracing any kind of ideological pan-Americanism. That's been my point. Putin may be different, and I certainly concede to you much more knowledge about Putin than I have. But I don't think the people who voted for Brexit, the majority of them, or the people who voted for Trump, the majority of them, are what I would call pan-Americans or UK people. Do you want to respond to that, Masha? Because you've thought a lot about this.
I think I agree with your sort of current assessment. I just, my suspicion is that these are actually sort of the impulses that are very easily triggered. And so the fact that most of the people who voted for Trump are probably, in their heart of hearts, more isolationist than expansionist, doesn't give me peace of mind, because I think that that the sort of the conversation that Trump is both initiating and entering is a conversation about world dominance, and it's sort of where power is measured by the degree to which a country can expand. Yeah.
Okay. Great. I see that Roger, I just want to let Roger Tan come back and clarify his question, because it seems like I didn't answer the right question.
Thank you, Roger. I'm wondering about this concept because I find Arendt proposed some kind of contrast between nation state and republic, and it seems like it relates her argument on revolution. On the one side, it is some kind of good. She praised American Revolution, republic. On the other side is what she dislikes, the continental France, nation state. And in our revolution, what a crucial reason she criticized the French Revolution is a social problem. And in her argument in nation state here, she refers like one crucial characteristic of nation state is that it is made by different classes. So can you hear me?
What, different what?
Different classes.
Classes.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, is there some kind of deep meaning in the concept of nation state here? Because it seems like it is beyond some kind of pure orthodox meaning of the ethnics. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Yes, it's related. I don't know if it's different, but she puts a slightly different emphasis on it in some of her later writing, as you point out. A nation state is a state dominated by a particular nation or nationality or nation group. And in her writing on America, which she begins in the late 1950s and early 1960s, she begins to articulate a thesis that America was the only non-nation state in the world, or at least the most successful non-nation state in the world. The argument being that unlike all the European states that were either France had a nation, Franks, the Germans, the Germans, the English, in America there was no American. It was for her a land of immigrants, and it was a constitutionally constituted state in which every group could come and live as Jews, live as Germans, live as Italians, live as Irish, and could, in her mind, participate politically without any disadvantage. Now, there are obvious exceptions to this. The largest being African Americans and women, and to a certain extent Indians or Native Americans. And she talks about those. But her argument, and it's one that's obviously very controversial, is that the basic foundational myth and structure of America was non-nationalist, but was statist. She worries in her later interviews, in the last 3 or 4 interviews she gives, she begins to say things like, America had never been a nation state until the post-World War II Cold War era. And she worries that the driving anti-communism of America and the increasing centralization of power in the Washington bureaucracy, the federal government, and away from the states, was creating a kind of American jingoism, American nationality that was threatening the tradition of America as a non-nationalist state. And so in a number of her later interviews, she highlights that worry quite explicitly, and says such things. I think now there have been periods in American history that have been very jingoistic and very nationalist, but her argument, I think, would be that for most of American history, the mythology of America was not about to the extent that it was about Americans. It was about Americans as a land of a melting pot of different people with different worlds, and allowing for people to live in their own social worlds. I think to me, this is personal, one of the most disturbing things about the nationalist movement going on around Donald Trump is the rejection of this constitutionalist tradition of American statehood and a kind of elevation of an Americanist nationalist rhetoric that I find deeply out of step with what I think of as the American tradition. But some people might say that that's just been the way it has been all along, and I've been wrong. But that's how she understands. So that a republican constitutional state cannot be a nation state. Just to add one last thing to to answer his question, that's the reason although she supported the state of Israel and the founding of the state of Israel, she opposed the founding of Israel as a Jewish state. And it was precisely on this ground, because what she said was that if you make it into a Jewish state, it becomes a nation state, and then it can't treat its minorities equally once it's a nation state, because that will make the Jews the first among nations, just as in France, the Franks were the first among nations, etc. And so this was a deep part of her thinking, and it got expanded into her political thinking throughout her life.
Roger?
Yeah.
Harold here. On this issue of nation state, I'd like to refer us back to Germany. There was a large German exodus and immigration into the United States when the cities of Germany became overcrowded with industrialization. When that happened and those individuals immigrated into the U.S., it was seen in Germany that they lost their Germanness, that the only way that one could actually maintain their Germanness, be Volk, V-O-L-K, was to have that relationship with the German land. And so what in my study I've come to understand is that the frustration with not having much land in Africa that they could control, so they could turn it into German land in which the Volk could keep this relationship with the land. So when the Nazis took over, their Volk, or the nation, the people, the German people, needed a state to expand so that they actually would have land that could become German land, and that they could push the boundaries of Germany, not for some imperialist economic idea, but really because they wanted to create Germany, an expanded Germany, because you can only be a German if you're on German land. And the reason that they know that is because when people came to the US, they no longer were German, quote unquote German. Although I do want to say that if in a survey, if you survey all of US citizens, 17% will say that they're of German heritage. If you just do white people, it's 29%. So there is still this sense of Germanness without the land here in the US. That was my comment.
Thanks, Harold. You know, I don't know enough to respond to it in full. I think it's I think there were a lot of Germans who saw Germans anywhere in the world as part of Germany, and there were others who were very much more connected to the Lebensraum argument. We need our land. Blut und Boden was one of the formulations, the blood and ground. But certainly the Nazis cared a lot about the Germans who were in Austria and Poland and other places. It wasn't just more land, it was also bringing Germans together, whatever state or country they were in. Why don't we, for at least a short period, shift a little bit to this question that Jack had originally intimated that we haven't gotten to. Jack, do you want to read your original question, which takes us back to this chapter 3, Jews in Society?
Okay, let me see if I can find it here. I know I have it here, so I can. What my original question was. To what extent does Arendt's lengthy and complex discussion of the Jews and society reflect her own ambivalence as an emancipated Jew? And to what degree is her analysis skewed by the facts of her own experience?
Yeah, you know, these are important questions, and a lot of it is, you know, a lot of it is ad hominem. Bob mentioned, I think, in one of his comments, the stuff about Heidegger. I mentioned earlier that people have accused her of reading Nazi sources. You know, so it's important to some degree to remember a few things that I'd like to talk just to explain. One is that Arendt was Jewish. She was an assimilated Jew early on, although, as she says frequently, even as a child, she was taught very specifically by her mother. Her father died when she was quite young. That if anybody ever insulted her or attacked her as a Jew, that she was to respond, get up, and walk out of school and come home. She was not someone who hid her Jewishness or who made excuses for anti-Semites. She worked for Zionist organizations in the 30s, early 30s, was arrested, made her way to France, worked again very strongly for Zionist organizations, including leading a group of Jewish children to Israel with Aliyah, and made it to the United States after she was interned in an internment camp in Gors, and again worked in Jewish organizations, and went, I think I said this last class, went to Europe as a representative for World Jewry for the Jewish Committee on Reconstruction. She went to Zionist congresses. She was deeply involved in Jewish reading groups. So, you know, Arendt was not someone who hid or denied her Jewishness, and that needs to be said quite clearly. She deeply felt that assimilation, what she came to believe is that assimilation was dangerous. Assimilation led Jews to trade for political admittance into society, trade who they were. And she became an enormous critic of assimilation and those who would conform in any kind of assimilated way in order to get economic or social benefits from it. So, what's her relation to her own ambivalence as an emancipated Jew? I think it's complicated, but she deeply felt that Jews needed to defend themselves as Jews. And so when she would give a talk, if it was if it's a philosophy talk, maybe not, but any kind of award that she got, she would immediately start and say, I come to you and speak as a Jew. And she did that because she wanted to let people know she was a Jew. She wanted to not deny it. And it was an important part of her politics. One of the things that she liked, I think, most about the United States, which is a country she loved, was that she felt it was the first place in her life where she could be both a citizen and a Jew. And that to be a Jew and to live as a Jew didn't mean to give up one's citizenship and vice versa. Now, she was not a religious Jew, but she was, well, a political Jew. And she embraced, for her, one important part of the Jewish tradition, which was what she called pariahdom, an outsider status. And so what she ended up, the way she claimed her Judaism, was to say that Jews were historically a pariah people, an outsider people. And most of them were outsiders because they were forced to be outsiders. But someone like herself, who had entry into the mainstream and the establishment, could embrace her Judaism by becoming what she called, taking a language from Bernard Lazare, a conscious pariah. And consciously being an outsider. And that is how she came to understand both her own self as an outsider who looked at society from the outside and commented upon it and sought to understand it, but was not actively engaged generally in politics, and as a Jew. So there's a lot to be said about
Roger, could I?
Ian. There's a lot of people who
going to build on.
Let's go with someone. Ian.
Yeah, I just can you see me and hear me all right? I just wanted to bring up both the question that John just asked and what Sam brought up right before that, which I think is incredibly important, and I can just let both of them actually talk about what they wanted to talk about. But I think as a sort of transition, there's a really important relationship between what you were talking about, Roger, in terms of her particular relation and the role of Jews in society, and how she's attempting to the role of the nation, and the particular place of Sam points out, which is really interesting, which is the role of the mob, which gets into this is coming out of
Ian, I'm going to interrupt you. Ian, yeah, I'm interrupting you because your connection is not very good, and you keep going in and out, so we're having a hard time hearing you.
Fair enough. I turned off my video. Can you hear me a little better?
So far, so good.
Okay, great. I was just trying to highlight something that I think unites what you were just saying to what Sam was asking and what John is asking, which is that one of the things that's critical to understanding both Arendt's relationship to Jewish assimilation and the role of Jews in society, and also her understanding of nationalism and critically, as Sam is pointing out, the mob, is her relationship to society and her understanding of what society is and the role that it plays, both politically and also non-politically. So the whole danger of the role of the Jew, and also the question of assimilation for her, is the question of the translation of the Jew from a social figure, as she points out in this chapter, became a sort of fetishized, useful social figure for the French bourgeoisie and the politicized Jew. And the nation itself, and this is her problem with Zion, is what happens when you attempt to translate a social category. And the nation is fundamentally a social category. And I take Masha's point that when we're talking about Putin, the reinvocation of pan-Slavism is the reinsertion of a social category. What happens when you take a social category and turn it into a political category, right? Nationalism as a political force is the translation of a social pan-Aryanism in the case of Germans, not pan-Germanism. That's incredibly important. It's not the expansion of the German nation. It's the expansion of the Aryan nation for the Nazis. What happens when you translate this fundamentally social category into a political one, right? And that's what makes nationalism and imperialism a tension and not just an opposition. Nationalism isn't opposed to imperialism. It's critical to imperialism, but it's also in tension with it.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what gets us to both, from what I understand, John and Sam's questions, which I was saying I will just turn it over to them to talk about them. But
Okay.
the mob is a really strange and interesting category that I want to talk about for her.
Okay. Well, let's have Sam and John. John, you haven't spoken yet. So, John, why don't you ask your question, which is a long one, so I'm having trouble reading it. Why don't you see if you can either read parts of it or express it?
Okay, so I'm always guilty of typing out these things because I don't think anything, especially when it comes to Arendt, exists in isolation. She is so well thought out and so cohesive that she's almost hard to discuss or describe to other people in full. But one thing, she's talking about, as I read it, simply an evolution from early medieval times and feudal structures to the emergence of nation states, followed by imperialist kind of competitive capitalism, which is not isolationist in the way a nation state is, but more interrelational on the basis of competition. And she talks about that with the Jews as well, when, for instance, simplification, the Rothschilds place 5 boys within the 5 urban centers of Europe, right? So the interrelatedness of international capital remains in place. But, so this can all, and that's kind of the stuff that we're throwing out there. I'm not sure, I think all of us are probably also trying to relate a lot of this to what we're experiencing here in Trumpland at this point. I just came back from the Netherlands, and they're very interested in how this has happened, and they have their own Geert Wilders and France's Marie Le Pen in Hungary and Poland. I mean, this is a global phenomenon that populism, quote unquote, is the issue of the day, is according to popular media, yeah. And her observation that societies, and she draws this into anti-Semitism as well because of their economic connection to governing structures, their funding of them and their wars, that we're willing to tolerate a Donald Trump and all his vulgarity, as long as he serves some sort of purpose for us or not, billionaire or not. But as a status quo power structure that has stopped serving people in any way, even through exploitation, if there's a payoff, we rebel against. And isn't that perhaps what's informing the populism today? And doesn't that perhaps leave us at least open to a kind of semi-totalitarianism at present? I think that we have enough checks and balances that may not ultimately result in that, but I'm interested in the fact that we have a tinge of that in our rhetoric today, flying across all our computers, and it is frightening and unsettling. Yeah, that's all.
Thanks, John. you know, there's no doubt. There's a lot in what you say, and I'm not gonna be able to get to all of it. I think you have to be very careful with the word totalitarianism today. Again, this book is about the elements of totalitarianism, right? She calls it the Origins, but we talked about last class how that's not the actual title. It was called The Burden of Our Times. When she talks about it, she's like, Origins was actually not my word. I don't like it. It's the elements. And there's no doubt that many of the elements of totalitarianism that she identified continue to exist in the world today. That's why she actually wrote the book. And she thinks that totalitarianism is forever in the modern world an ever-present danger because many of these elements are tied to our modern world, like homelessness, rootlessness, and loneliness. And another is a distrust of nation states. And we've been talking about the mob and the nation state and imperialism. But and so while there's a way in which I've argued, and some of you have contested it, and I think that's great, that there's a way in which Donald Trump is a nationalist, as are some of these other figures, you can't, I think, understand his victory without understanding the fact that he attacked the institutions of the nation state. He attacked the Congress. He attacked the two political parties. He attacked the media. And he attacked government, especially the federal government, and regulations and government interference. And this relates to his populism, as John was bringing it up. I think he is a deeply populist figure. There are further elements of totalitarianism in his attack on truth and his attack on facts. But let's remember, liberals and the media have been defactualizing themselves for a long time. And I know people don't like to talk about that. I'm not equating them. I think what Trump is doing is at another level. But for defactualization to become totalitarianism, for Hannah Arendt at least, one essential additional fact is necessary, which is that it's not that you just deny reality and you brazenly deny reality, but you're willing to commit crimes and murder and assassination in order to make your denial of reality real. And while that may happen in some other countries, I think potentially in Russia and Turkey and other places, it certainly hasn't happened here yet. And I don't anticipate it happening. If it does happen, we're in trouble. Let me put it that way. But because we are not yet at the point where we're willing to use all means, including murder and assassination and crime, in order to make the alternate facts seem real, we're not yet in a totalitarian world. Because for Arendt, one of the core aspects of totalitarianism is that its essence is terror, and we're not yet in terror. I was shortly after the election, I went to a play in New York and was talking to my mother-in-law and said something about Trump, and some lady came up to me and said, "Don't say that out loud. You're going to be put in jail." And I looked at her and said, "You've got to be out of your mind." But it's that attitude that assumes terror, which will lead to terror because it will normalize it. And we can't give into that, which is why it's very important that we continue to speak and call lies lies and call defactualization defactualization. And I think Arendt shows us that the line that we just cannot let cross is the line of terror. There are some more questions. Reza, do you want to ask your question? Or Amy Zion, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hello.
Oh, hi.
Hi. Can you hear
Hi,
me?
Reza.
Hello. Just I want to know that's what was her role and view about the creation of Israel as a Jew country.
She had no official role. She was very involved in Zionist conversations and in Zionist reading groups, and she wrote for a lot of the Jewish American newspapers in the United States. She was what might be called a labor Zionist on one hand, but mostly she was opposed to the Jabotinsky Zionism, that Israel should be a Jewish country. She thought that Israel should be made a place for Jews to find refuge after the war, after the Holocaust, and she became an advocate of what was called a federated Israel or Palestine, in which in Jerusalem, Jews and Arabs would govern jointly, and Christians and other religions. And outside of Jerusalem, they would create a federated structure with Jewish and Palestinian and other communities. And so she was an advocate for a kind of binational or multinational federal state in Israel. We're not going to talk much about that in this book. It's not essential to this book, but if you're interested more in that writings in the book that's been edited by Jerome Cohen, Arendt's Jewish Writing, Jerome Cohen and Ron Feldman, you can read her essays on Zionism Reconsidered and other essays on the state of Israel where she makes these cases. Sam, do you want to go back to your question about the mob?
I can if you want. I mean, it came up before when we were, I think Ian tied what I was pointing to together nicely with what you were talking about. Arendt draws this sharp distinction in talking about anti-Semitism between social anti-Semitism and political anti-Semitism. And she says that I didn't see the political anti-Semitism. But Arendt, then she draws, before she talks about the Dreyfus affair, she draws this really interesting, I think, and provocative distinction between the people and the mob. The people always fighting for representation, and the mob, this always cheering on the strong man. I can't read that without thinking about Donald Trump now, and supporting the great leader. And she says that they're made up of the residue of the classes. So the mob is tied to the decline of the nation state, in the sense that totalitarianism moves us towards a classless society, whereas a nation state is inherently dependent upon a structure of a classed society. And it's this breakdown which starts to produce this amorphous mob, which is an element of totalitarianism for Arendt. And I think, and also is productive of then what she calls terror. And I think, I'm not sure. I think that some people are, I think that we're part of the populist movement, just to tie it into contemporary politics, that we're witnessing, we could think about as a mob. And I know that that's contentious, but I think I hear from a lot of people that they do feel terror, that they feel like their basic human rights in a Trump presidency, right to healthcare, right to abortion, right to be married to who they want to be married, etc., are under threat right now, and that's disruptive of their social lives.
That I know that is a widespread feeling, and we need to address it. So thank you for putting it out there. I just want to make one clarification that Arendt in this book makes a distinction between the mob and the mass, and it's not always entirely clear. But in the Dreyfus section, she's talking about the mob, not the mass. And later in the book, she's going at some points talk about the mob and later the mass. We'll talk a lot about that when we get to the last section of the book on totalitarianism, because she thinks that totalitarianism is not associated with mobs, it's associated with masses. And masses are, as Sam said, made up of in a classless society, the detritus of all the different classes who don't belong and thus are lonely and homeless and seeking to belong to a movement. The difference is that a mob can still be part of a class and simply want power and find that the holders of power, the bourgeoisie in most instances, are hold power illegitimately, and the mob finds that power illegitimate and therefore wants to take power. And whereas the mass is not actually so interested in taking power, they're interested in finding meaning in their lives and a movement. So that's going to be something we'll have to talk a lot about. It's one of the more, I think Arendt is at times inconsistent in her usage, and it's one of the more complicated parts of trying to read her, but it'll come up more when we read totalitarianism. I want to just, in what Sam was saying, which I think was really important, I want to read from page 108, which is, I think, very much related to what's going on in the world today. And on the first full paragraph in 108, this is in the section on the Dreyfus affair, Arendt writes, excluded as it is from society and political representation, the mob turns of necessity to extra parliamentary action. So here's the mob. This isn't the masses. This is the lower classes. And the lower classes become excluded from society and political representation. They feel that from corruption and power, they have lost their democratic or ability to influence. They've been disenfranchised. And thus it is inclined to seek the real forces of political life in those movements and influences which are hidden from view and work behind the scenes. And this is when the mob embraces conspiracy theorists. And I mean, this is what we are seeing deeply today around the world, not just in the United States. Now, masses do this too, right? This is one of those situations where I think this is one of those places where she could be talking about both the mob and the masses. But she's here, calls it the mob. She's talking about France, where she thinks that the breakdown of the classes was not as strong as it was in Germany. And so I just put this out there. Amy Zion, are you here still? Do you want to ask your question?
Hey, Roger, can you hear me? I'm not sure if I have a mic on.
It's on. Got it.
Okay, thanks. This is sort of changing the topic a bit, but I wanted to know if you could comment on some post by Elliot Lustig, who's reading The Origins of Totalitarianism, and made some comments that, I guess I'll just read them really quickly, but Arendt notes that decent liberals of the 1930s Germany would fact-check the Nazis' bizarre claims about Jews like they were meant to be factual. What they failed to understand, Arendt suggests, is that the Nazi Jew-hating was not a statement of fact, but a declaration of intent. So when someone would blame the Jews for Germany's defeat in World War I, naive people would counter by saying there's no evidence of that. What the Nazis were doing was not describing what was true, but what would have to be true to justify what they planned next. Did 3 million illegals cast votes in this election? Clearly not, but fact-checking is just a way of playing along with their game. What Trump is saying is not that 3 million illegals voted. What he's saying is, I'm going to steal the voting rights of millions of Americans. Fascism is the opposite of conservatism because it refuses to acknowledge reality as a limitation on the scope of human will. Unfortunately, most conservatives in America today only have an eye for that phenomenon when they see communists doing it. No harm ever came from overestimating the danger of a political situation. Both civilizations have been lost from underestimating it. So I guess my question is if you, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's great. You're jumping us way ahead into the totalitarianism section. The quotations that I don't know who Elliot Lustig is, but that he's citing are on pages 384 and 385 of Origins. It's just as a side note, I know I've been writing a lot about this, so that's why it's in my head. But I was interviewed by a journalist yesterday who asked me about almost that exact quote that you read, and it's not a quote from Arendt. And I said to him, "Where'd you get that?" And he says, "It's all over the internet." And I went and looked. about the idea of motives, of that a statement of facts is dissolved into motives. And it's all over the internet, but it's not actually a quote. It's a paraphrase of Arendt made by Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the 1990s that has been widely disseminated and is in all these quote boards. But the actual quote, just so we have it, right, is that the elite is not composed of ideologists. Its members' whole education is aimed at abolishing their capacity for distinguishing between truth and falsehood, between reality and fiction. Their superiority consists in their ability to immediately dissolve every statement of fact into a declaration of purpose. And she does go on to say, and I think this is very important, and it's something that the media should all learn and read, that to simply fact check is useless, because the claim that's being made is not a statement of fact. It's a statement of purpose. That's, I think, the essential point that you're bringing up and that Arendt made, and it's one of the great insights of the book. What that purpose is not clear, and Elliot Lustig, in what you just read, sort of assumes he knows Trump's purpose, which is to bring fascism to the country and do away with voting rights. I happen to disagree with him. I don't think that's Trump's purpose. That said, I don't think any of us know what Trump's purpose is. I'm not sure Trump does. I think one of the most fascinating things about Trump is that I think he goes by the gut. He's not an ideologue. He doesn't have a full blown out agenda. That's my reading. Not everyone has to agree with me. But there's no doubt that Trump and Bannon, and what unites Trump and Steve Bannon, is an incredibly profound insight into the fact that most Americans, or let's put it this way, large numbers of Americans, and we might even say most, simply do not believe what people in power tell them. They don't believe the media, and they don't believe the government, and they don't believe businessmen, most businessmen. They have complete contempt, and they think that everything is an interested, corrupt lie. What Trump and Bannon have seen is that they can use that to sow incredible uncertainty, cynicism, and to a certain extent nihilism. And that now the question is, why do it? Right? What's the purpose? What's the when he denies facts about voting rights or about illegal voting or about the size of the crowd? Yeah, to point out that he's lying is simple, but it doesn't have an impact. Why not? What's the purpose? And it's a good question, and I don't know if I have an answer to it. I think that one purpose of it is to take away the power of the elite, the media elite, the academic elite, the government's elite. There's no doubt that Trump is actively trying to disempower the class of people, Republican and Democrat, who've run this country for the last 20 to 30 or 40 or 50 years. And he's succeeding. And what will come of that, I don't know. Is it an empowering of a working class populist agenda? Is it fascism? Is it something else? Is it a billionaire agenda? I don't know. And I don't think any of us really know. We can all have our guesses. But he is, with incredible canniness and intelligence and insight, destroying the power structures that have governed this country for a long time. The same power structures that many of us on the left and the right have been calling corrupt for the last 20 or 30 years. And yet we don't trust him to be the destroyer of them. Well, I mean, I'll stop there. Amy, you want to respond to that?
No, I mean, you responded to it. I mean, I think I was just relating it to these chapters because she makes the comment, sorry, I don't have a page number, about Jews after World War I, making the joke about bicycles and Jews being an equal cause for the war, as if to sort of make light of that. But what she says is it's not the statement itself, it's the fact that people believe it. that should be emphasized?
Well, she says that there's a reason that the Jews, to say the bicycles is arbitrary, but the Jews, there's a reason. That doesn't mean that the Jews are at fault, and it doesn't mean we should blame the Jews or that they're responsible. It's a fine line, and it's one that she's been criticized for. But what she says is, one reason that the Jews were used is the Jews' claim of exceptionalness and chosenness, which contrasted and conflicted with the Nazis' claim of chosenness. Another was their claim for separateness, their desire to be separate so that they could preserve their traditions and their religion, which led them to seek privileges and be seen as different in an age in which everyone was supposed to be equal. Neither of these things, she thinks, are things that the Jews should be faulted for or that they are guilty of. They're not. These are just things that they were in their interest to pursue. But they allowed them to be used, and it wasn't arbitrary that they were used. I mean, one could ask some interesting questions about groups that have become associated with the corrupt classes that Trump is going after, right? A lot of identity politics and other things. And I think that you could make an argument that, again, a lot of the animosity towards different racial and religious and identity groups is actually less about whether it's anti-black or Hispanic or anti-gay or anti-women, and it's more about these groups being associated with what's now seen as a corrupt power structure. That's one way to read a similarity between what Arendt was describing in the 30s and what's going on now. I'm not wedded to that. I'm saying it's one connection that one can make.
Roger, can I make one quick addition there?
Yep.
The one thing that I would add is that's important to the discussion of this chapter is that on the terms you described and on Arendt's terms, that is anti-Semitism, right? That's the difference that you opened up between anti-Semitism with a small s and anti-Semitism with an large S. The fact that Trump is not overtly associating it with the Jews doesn't mean that it isn't carrying the same form of ideological anti-Semitism that Arendt is trying to nail down.
Well, Ian, I accept that what you're saying is it's not associated with real Jews. It's more of associated with the idea of a Jew, just like it's not associated with real blacks or Hispanics or women or gays. It's more associated with the idea. So I think that is right. The difference is anti-Semitism, as it emerged in the 19th century, was an ideology of extermination. And again, I hope I'm right, but so far we haven't seen that. And that does seem to me a difference. No? Do you accept that?
I don't disagree, but I think that there is very little in the chapter about anti-Semitism that says that a critical correlate of anti-Semitism from the outset was extermination. In fact, I think that's part of what she highlights towards the end of anti-Semitism is quite strange about Nazi anti-Semitism, or at least unique, which is that anti-Semitism was enormously prevalent in France, as she describes, in Germany, in Italy, in Britain, in the United States. But only in Germany was the correlate of anti-Semitism the extermination and elimination of Jews from the social body.
Okay, so yes. So we can make a distinction between anti-Semitism and totalitarian anti-Semitism. I think would be helpful.
But however, anti-Semitism continues into the 21st century and carries with it the idea of extermination. So Jew hatred today, which is widespread and sometimes I'm astounded at how widespread it is in places where there are very few Jews, right, carries with it the history that the Nazis have given it. And so many people, when they adopt anti-Semitic ideas or anti-Semitic visions, include extermination in them. And so you see American anti-Semites, for example, trolls on the internet speaking of gassing you or throwing you into the ovens and de-skinning you and so on and so forth. There is no such thing any longer as a distinction in the image of anti-Semitism between the political anti-Semitism, which aren't correctly described, right, and Jew hatred, which has been around for quite a long time and will always be a potential tool for budding totalitarians.
Anyone want to pick this up? These are very interesting points, and I think very helpful.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
Where, if anywhere, did Arendt seriously, in depth, engage the Jewish religion and especially its theologies? Because when I read Arendt, I see a lot of it moving through her thought, but she's translating it into more secular terms.
So let's just first say, Ron, that Arendt didn't know much about Jewish religion. She was not a practicing Jew ever in her life. The one friend of hers who taught her a lot about Jewish religion was Gershom Scholem, and she read his books very closely. And if you get Jerome Cohn's book on Arendt and Judaism, Arendt and the Jewish Question, you can find her reviews of Gershom Scholem's books, which include discussions of Kabbalah and Sabbatic Judaism and others. And she always interprets them with a political angle, not a religious angle. It's just who she was. She was not a religious person. So, her Judaism was a political and cultural Judaism, not a religious Judaism.
But she did engage, she engaged Augustine, she engaged Christian theologians.
Yes, but not on theology. I mean, she was interested in Augustine insofar as she could find a politics in Augustine.
I understand.
Yeah.
I guess I'm not ready fully to accept quite such a wall, but I'll have to do the kind of reading you're suggesting.
Yeah, read her stuff on Gershom Scholem. That's as close as you're going to get. There's not much, and I don't think it's going to probably satisfy you, but you'll see the way she takes religious history, Gershom Scholem's religious history, and politicizes it and reads it politically.
But there's I'd just like to at least contemplate or speculate that she did have at some level a running controversy with certain aspects of Jewish theology, including chosenness, and that she's drawing to some degree upon a prophetic tradition, which she may not have recognized or even owned, but it just seems to be there in some respects.
I think that's right. I think she's more interested in the ways that Jews write and talk about anti-Semitism and the way that anti-Semites write and talk about Jews and anti-Semitism. And what she finds is that both Jews and anti-Semites talk about chosenness, and that's why that concept comes up in her writing. She's not interested in the religious aspect. For those who are, she thinks that's great, but that's not who she is. I'm just going to quickly take this question from Crystal. Crystal, do you want to phrase your question for me, and then will be the last question? Or are you gone? Crystal in Carolina. Crystal says, we have created terror in the Middle East, but have created a myth about it in the media here. And Carolina says that she disagrees with my point on not being in terror. And this is something that Sam said also. The mass incarceration of blacks and the violence directed at minorities, although not in terror at the scale that it was used in Germany and the Nazis, is real in this country. I think that is an important point. There is no doubt that there are communities in this country that feel unsafe. And I think Caroline is also right that it's different than it was in both the Soviet Union under Stalin and the Nazis under Hitler. And when we read the sections on totalitarianism, this is what I would like to say is we will talk a lot more about that, okay? And we'll talk a lot about what she means by terror in the discussion on totalitarianism. I just see a new question that Joseph put up, and we're really out of time. Joseph, do you want to quickly answer your question or put it in the room, and I'll see if I can do a quick answer, or if not, we'll come back to it.
Let's see. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Great. I don't know if you can see me either. This is my first time chiming in. My question is, sorry, it's a kind of a long question, but I'm just wondering about the kind of cautious optimism that you're attempting to pose here, Roger. I wonder about the, because I'm thinking now about Eichmann and Jerusalem and thinking about how for totalitarianism under the Nazis calls for deportation. A rhetoric of deportation functioned as a pretext for the politics of terror that you're describing, for the politics of extermination. So we already see that sort of rhetoric right now, obviously. And on another level,
can I interrupt in 1 second, Joseph? There's a difference between deportation and denationalization. What the sort of, if you look at, again, we'll read this later in this book, but the 3 steps towards totalitarianism are the killing of the juridical individual, the killing of the dignified individual, and someone remind me of the 3rd one. But the point is denationalization and taking away people's citizenship is really a key function. Deporting illegals is a problem, and she talks about the fact that there are refugees and people who have no home and the stateless people, and that is a problem. And so we do need that. That I think is a good point, and we need to think about the place of refugees. And I think Trump's attack just yesterday, I believe, on refugees and saying that we would cease to take in refugees is deeply dangerous, much more so than his worry about illegal immigration, in my own understanding of how Arendt would see it. But I'll let you continue, Joseph. I'm sorry.
No, that's it. Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Okay, that's I think that's helpful to make that clarification. The other point I was going to raise, I don't have to ask it now because I see that we're out of time, but the other point I was going to raise was about how there are certain fringe elements of the self-identified alt-right making moves to try to suggest the possibility of forced sterilizations for certain minority peoples. Now, these are obviously really fringe calls, but I wonder about the similarities or the differences there. So that's just the last thought I had.
I'm going to leave it at that. I want to make 2 announcements, and I want to thank all of you for participating. This was a great conversation. I learned a lot. First of all, we're going to start a new service on Tuesdays from 7 to 8 Eastern time in the United States, which is 7. I forget what it is on the global time, but it's 7 o'clock in New York time. We're going to have a chat system. It's not video, but you can type in questions and conversations. And Ian Story, one of our associate fellows, and maybe some of our other fellows will be on to respond and engage in conversation on chat for those of you who want to continue the conversation about this. And then the last thing is we will meet next week to discuss the beginning of the Imperialism section. This is the key section of the book. If you want to understand Arendt, and we're gonna go a little slower. We're gonna read one chapter a week, and I very much look forward to discussing the next few chapters with you. I'll have the video lecture up, I hope, by Monday, and hope you enjoy it, and we can talk about it next week. Thank you all very much, and I hope you continue to enjoy reading Arendt. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you.
Roger.
Thank you.